Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really fascinating subject, poetry, and its place in early Islam.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it should be a really interesting one.
I'm looking forward to it.
Our primary source for this deep dive is going to be the Sahih Muslim, specifically Book 28, which is dedicated entirely to the topic of poetry.
Okay.
Now, before we jump in, I think it might be helpful to set the stage a bit. To really appreciate this topic, we need to kind of travel back in time, go back to 7th century Arabia,
Okay.
and imagine what life was like back then. Poetry was absolutely central to their culture.
Right.
And in fact, it was so much more than just, an art form or a means of entertainment. It was really how they chronicled their history, praised their heroes, fueled rivalries, even settled disputes.
It's hard to overstate the importance of poetry. It really was the lifeblood of their culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And poets held a place of really high esteem in society, their words carrying immense weight and influence.
Absolutely. Their eloquence could sway public opinion. It could incite wars. It could even forge alliances.
Right.
The power of their verses was really undeniable.
So then Islam emerges, right?
Yeah.
With its own divine scripture, the Quran,
Hmm.
which brought forth this whole new set of values and beliefs. So the question becomes, how did this new faith, with its emphasis on divine revelation, view this existing tradition of poetry?
That's a great question.
Did it embrace it? Did it reject it?
Hmm.
Or was it something somewhere in between?
That's where it gets really interesting. What we find in the Sahih Muslim is not a simple black and white answer. The Hadith, which are the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, they paint a very nuanced picture. We see instances where the Prophet himself expresses admiration for certain poets and their verses,
Oh, wow.
yet we also find these cautionary tales about the potential pitfalls of poetry.
Okay, so it's almost like a paradox.
Right. Absolutely. Appreciation alongside caution. It's a fascinating dynamic.
So to kind of unpack this seeming contradiction, let's start by examining the Prophet's own interactions with poetry.
Sounds good.
And I think a good place to begin is with this anecdote from Sahih Muslim that offers a really fascinating glimpse into the Prophet's personal views on poetry. It involves one of his companions, a man named Amr ibn Sharid, who is known for his ability to recite poetry.
Okay, what happened?
Well, one day, the Prophet specifically requested Amr to recite some poems by this pre-Islamic poet named Umayyah ibn Abi as-Salt, who was known for his profound wisdom and insights about life.
So the Prophet himself is requesting poetry from a pre-Islamic era. That's pretty surprising.
Yeah, it is pretty striking. And here's what makes it even more interesting. After Amr would recite each couplet, the Prophet would encourage him to continue saying, "Go on, go on."
Yeah.
And this went on until Amr had recited 100 verses of Umayyah's poetry.
100 verses. That's quite a poetry session.
Yeah, it is. And it really suggests that the Prophet wasn't at all averse to poetry. It seems that he really appreciated the beauty and the artistry of language, even when it came from a poet who lived before Islam.
Right, exactly. It speaks volumes about his open-mindedness and his willingness to engage with beauty and wisdom, regardless of its source.
Yeah.
Now, this particular poet, Umayyah ibn Abi as-Salt, he was quite a fascinating figure. Despite living in the pre-Islamic era, he's often described as being almost a Muslim due to the themes that he explored in his poetry. His verses often touched upon the oneness of God, the futility of worldly pursuits, and the importance of living a virtuous life.
Interesting.
All themes that really resonated deeply with the core message of Islam.
So it seems like the Prophet wasn't just passively listening to poetry, but he was actually seeking out poetry that conveyed these profound truths and values that aligned with his own teachings. But, I'm also recalling those hadith that seem to warn against poetry.
Right.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory stances?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that has been pondered by scholars for centuries. These cautionary hadith, they paint a very different picture from the anecdote that we just discussed. And one hadith in particular uses this incredibly vivid imagery to highlight the potential dangers of certain types of poetry. It states that it is better for a man's belly to be stuffed with pus, which corrodes it, than to stuff one's mind with frivolous poetry.
Whoa, that's some pretty strong imagery.
It is. It really underscores the seriousness with which certain types of poetry were viewed.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting that there's even another version of this hadith that substitutes the word mind with belly, making that connection even more explicit.
So what exactly did the Prophet mean by frivolous poetry? Was it all poetry? Or were there specific types that he found objectionable?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? And it's essential to understand the context of these hadiths. Pre-Islamic poetry, as we discussed, it often glorified tribalism, it boasted about personal achievements, or it fueled rivalries and conflicts, all things that Islam sought to discourage, promoting instead unity, humility, and peace. So, when the hadith warn against frivolous poetry, they're likely referring to poetry that contradicts these core Islamic values.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about poetry itself being inherently good or bad,
Right.
but rather about the content and the potential impact it can have on individuals and society. It's kind of like saying a knife can be used to prepare a nourishing meal or to inflict a wound. It's all about the intent and the way it's used that determines its value.
Exactly. It's a great analogy. And this brings us to another really intriguing hadith that sheds further light on the Prophet's perspective. In this hadith, upon hearing a poet reciting verses, the Prophet instructs his companions to catch the Satan or detain the Satan.
Whoa, wait, what? Those are
Yeah.
some pretty strong words. That almost evokes a sense of urgency and concern.
It does, and it's a very powerful image that really conjures up this idea of poetry as a potential vessel for negative influences.
So what are we to make of this?
Well, scholars have interpreted this hadith in various ways. Some suggest that it points to the potential for poetry to be used for harmful purposes, like spreading falsehood or inciting violence, while others see it as a reminder that even beautiful words can be used to deceive or mislead. It's a cautionary tale that highlights the importance of discernment, of carefully examining the messages and ideas that are being conveyed through poetry, rather than simply being swept away by its aesthetic beauty or its emotional appeal.
So we're starting to see this much more nuanced picture emerge. It's not a simple case of the prophet endorsing all poetry or condemning it outright.
Right.
There's this clear distinction between poetry that elevates the soul and poetry that might potentially degrade it.
Precisely. It speaks to the profound wisdom of the Prophet Muhammad,
Hmm.
who recognized both the beauty and the potential dangers of this incredibly powerful art form.
Hmm. This reminds me of another hadith that seems completely unrelated at first glance, but I think it might actually offer some valuable insights into this discussion, and it's a hadith about chess.
Oh, okay. The hadith that states, "He who played chess is like one who dyed his hand with the flesh and blood of swine." Now, how could chess possibly be connected to poetry?
Right. It seems like quite a leap. But some scholars have drawn these parallels between the two, suggesting that both activities were seen as potential distractions from religious duties, or pursuits that could lead to undesirable behavior.
It's a fascinating connection, isn't it?
Yeah.
It prompts us to consider whether it's not so much about the specific activity itself, but rather the potential for any activity, whether it's chess, poetry, or even something seemingly harmless, to become an obsession that might actually hinder our spiritual growth or lead to neglect of our responsibilities.
It's a profound insight. It
Yeah.
really challenges us to examine our own lives and consider whether there are any activities or forms of entertainment that might be consuming our time and energy at the expense of more meaningful pursuits, or even leading us down a path that contradicts our values.
Exactly. It's an invitation to reflect on the things that we allow to occupy our minds and hearts, recognizing that everything we engage with has the potential to shape our thoughts, emotions, and actions. Hmm. And that's something worth pondering, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Welcome back.
To our deep dive into poetry in early Islam.
As we delve deeper into this topic,
Yeah.
we uncover these fascinating insights that can really guide us in navigating the complexities of our own modern lives.
Right, in the last segment, we talked about how the Prophet Muhammad both appreciated certain types of poetry, especially those that conveyed profound truths and resonated with Islamic values, while also expressing caution about the potential pitfalls of others,
Yeah.
particularly those deemed, frivolous.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that, in the eyes of early Muslims, poetry was this dynamic form of expression with the capacity to both elevate and corrupt.
And we were left with this crucial question. How did they determine what constituted frivolous poetry
Right.
versus poetry that was considered valuable and acceptable?
Right. So to address that question, let's examine some of the hadith that shed light on the specific types of poetry that were actually admired by the Prophet and his companions. And, remember that verse by the pre-Islamic poet Labid that we talked about earlier?
Oh, you mean the one that the Prophet described as the truest word spoken by an Arab in poetry?
Exactly. And it's worth repeating that verse because it's so powerful. Behold, apart from Allah, everything is vain.
It's a very profound statement. It really puts things into perspective, recognizing the ultimate reality of God and the transient nature of all things. Everything in this world is fleeting.
Precisely. And it's a core concept in Islam. And it's just fascinating to see it reflected in the poetry of a pre-Islamic poet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, where did that wisdom come from? It really makes you think.
Right. So it seems like one criterion for judging the merit of poetry in early Islam was this alignment with Islamic values and teachings, even if it came from a non-Muslim source.
Yeah, that's a plausible interpretation for sure. It highlights the open-mindedness of early Muslims and their willingness to, appreciate wisdom and truth wherever they found it.
Right. And if we apply that same principle to those hadith that warn against frivolous poetry, we can maybe infer that such poetry likely refers to verses that contradicted these core Islamic values.
Exactly. Poetry that, promoted tribalism or materialism or other ideas that were really at odds with the message of Islam. And
Mm.
think back to that image of filling one's belly with pus.
Right.
It's such a powerful metaphor. It really drives home the point about the spiritual harm that can come from consuming content that is just spiritually toxic,
Right.
content that goes against our core values and principles.
So it's not about condemning poetry as a whole, but recognizing that the content we consume has a real impact on our spiritual well-being.
Exactly. It's about being discerning,
Right.
about choosing what kind of content nourishes the soul versus what might actually poison it.
That's a really helpful way to understand it. And you know what? This brings us to a crucial point. While the specific context of poetry in 7th century Arabia may seem distant from our modern lives, the underlying principles and lessons are timeless and incredibly relevant to the challenges we face today.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, we may not be living in a world of, pre-Islamic poets and their elaborate verses, but we are constantly bombarded with information and content, just like they were.
Oh, yeah, for sure. In fact, we live in a world that's just saturated with media.
Mhm.
From music and movies to social media and video games, the sheer volume of content that we're exposed to on a daily basis is just overwhelming.
Absolutely. And so just as the Prophet Muhammad and early Muslims had to discern between beneficial and harmful poetry, we face a very similar challenge today in navigating this modern media landscape.
Yeah, we absolutely do. We need to develop our own internal filter, our own sense of discernment to sift through all the noise and make choices that are truly aligned with our values and conducive to our spiritual growth.
Exactly. So what questions can we ask ourselves to help us make these choices, to determine what content is truly beneficial versus what might be harmful or even, spiritually toxic?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
So here are a few things to consider. Does this content promote values that align with my beliefs? Does it uplift and inspire me, or does it leave me feeling empty or drained?
Hmm.
Or even worse,
Yeah.
does it make me want to engage in behaviors that go against my values or my principles?
Yeah, those are great questions. It's really about becoming conscious consumers,
Right.
making intentional choices about what we allow into our hearts and minds, recognizing that everything we consume has an impact on us.
And you know what? Just as we need to be mindful of what we eat physically,
Hmm.
we need to be equally mindful of what we feed our souls.
Exactly. What we choose to watch, listen to, read, and engage with, it all shapes our thoughts and emotions,
Right.
and ultimately our actions.
So this ancient wisdom from the Sahih Muslim, it's almost like a framework. It gives us a way to navigate the complexities of our modern world.
Hmm.
This world filled with information and entertainment that can either, elevate us or lead us astray.
Right. It reminds us that these principles of discernment, intentionality, and alignment with our values, they're timeless.
Right.
And they're essential for navigating any era, whether it's 7th century Arabia or
Yeah.
the 21st century digital world.
As we've been going through all these fascinating accounts of poetry in early Islam, one thing that really sticks out to me is the Prophet Muhammad's balanced approach. Like, he didn't just condemn poetry altogether,
Right.
even though it was so deeply ingrained in a culture that, Islam was transforming.
Yeah, it really speaks to the wisdom and the nuance of his approach. He recognized that poetry, just like any art form, could be a double-edged sword, capable of both expressing profound truths and also perpetuating really harmful ideas.
Exactly. And we saw how he, clearly delighted in the poetry of Umayyah ibn Abi's assault, whose verses reflected such deep wisdom and even kind of foreshadowed certain Islamic teachings. But at the same time, he also cautioned against poetry that promoted values that were contrary to the message of Islam, right?
Right.
He even used like really striking imagery to emphasize its potential to corrupt the soul.
Yeah, and you know what? That perspective that he had, that balanced perspective, it offers really valuable guidance for us today, especially as we try to navigate this media landscape that's so much more vast and complex than anything they could have imagined back in 7th century Arabia.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the underlying challenge remains the same, to discern between what nourishes our souls and what might diminish us.
So it's like a call to action almost.
Yeah.
To be, active, conscious consumers
Yeah.
of the constant stream of messages that we're bombarded with every day.
Exactly.
And not just passively receiving it all.
Right. Absolutely. The hadith that we've been exploring, they really encourage us to ask these critical questions. Does this content, does it align with my values?
Right.
Does it uplift me? Does it inspire me? Or does it leave me feeling kind of empty or anxious or even worse, tempted to act in ways that contradict my beliefs?
Yeah, those are really, really important questions.
Yeah.
And not just for entertainment, but for all forms of media that we're constantly encountering, what we're reading, watching, listening to. It all has a cumulative effect, I think,
Absolutely it does.
on our hearts and minds.
It shapes how we see the world. It shapes our understanding of everything.
It influences our choices. It really does. And this brings to mind another hadith. It's not explicitly about poetry,
Okay.
but it offers a really powerful analogy, I think,
Okay.
for how we should engage with any activity or form of entertainment. And it's the one about chess.
Okay.
The one comparing playing chess to staining one's hand with the blood of swine.
Right. A very striking image. And, on the surface, chess might seem completely unrelated to poetry or modern media, but I think the underlying principle is incredibly relevant. It's about recognizing the potential for any activity, even one that seems harmless, to become this kind of obsession that distracts us from what truly matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Our time and energy are so precious, and we have a responsibility to invest them wisely. This hadith really challenges us to ask ourselves, what are the chessboards of our time?
That's a good question.
The things that capture our attention and consume our hours, perhaps at the expense of more meaningful pursuits.
Yeah, that could be anything. I mean, it could be mindless scrolling on social media. It could be binge watching shows that leave us feeling drained rather than inspired. I think the key is to develop that self-awareness.
Right.
To cultivate that internal compass that guides our choices and helps us stay aligned with our values.
So if we were to, distill a key takeaway from all of
Yeah.
this for our listeners, what would it be? How can the wisdom of the Prophet and the insights from the Sahih Muslim help us navigate all the complexities of the world we live in today?
I think it all comes down to this. Embrace the beauty and the power of creative expression, whether it's poetry, music, film, whatever. But approach it all with a discerning heart and mind. Ask us critical questions.
Yeah.
Does this content nourish my soul? Does it align with my values? Does it inspire me to be a better person?
Right. And if the answer to any of those questions is no, then perhaps it's time to step back and reevaluate and make a conscious choice to invest our time and energy in something that's more aligned with who we really want to be.
Absolutely. It's a continuous journey. It's, a journey of learning and growth.
Right.
And we might stumble along the way. We may make choices that we regret later. But the key is to keep striving, to keep that intentionality,
Right.
and let our values guide us.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. It reminds us that we have agency. We have the power to shape our own inner world,
Yes, we do.
to choose what we allow to influence our hearts and minds. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of exploration. Until next time, may you find beauty, meaning, and inspiration in all that you engage with.